from dragon riding to dragon dreaming, from kings and queens to exiled royals and unknown bastards, House Targaryen has been a part of some of the greatest moments in the Game of Thrones universe. Arguably the most iconic house in A Song of Ice and Fire, the Targaryens have a deeper history than any other house in Westeros. They have birthed conquerors and warriors, great rulers and great oppressors, and they have some legendary family drama. This is going to be the first episode of this new series I'm making about the history of House Targaryen. Yet the entire history. Every king, every queen, every rogue prince and forgotten bastard. I'm going to try and cover every bit of interesting lore that I can find. I'm going to assume that you know the basics of A Song of Ice and Fire, but I will try and explain everything as extensively as I can so everyone can understand, even if you know absolutely nothing about Game of Thrones. So with that out of the way, let's get going. This episode is going to cover everything from the origins of the house to the death of the third king of the Iron Throne. So sit back, relax, and prepare yourself for violence, depression, and a whole ton of incest as we talk about the entire history of House Targaryen. If you guys think this is an interesting idea for a video, please do like and subscribe. It would really help a lot. And tell me in the comments if you want to see more of this. Now, most of the information in this video comes directly from the book, Fire and Blood, which is a great book, by the way. I highly recommend you read it, but it kind of reads like a history textbook. But that's why I'm here, to give you the synopsis so you don't have to read it all. If you've already read it, think of it as a refresher. If not, get ready for a huge deep dive into some Game of Thrones lore. Either way, we're gonna have a blast. I have no script for this video. This is all just me kind of talking from memory, and also like these 20 pages of notes that I have. Also, this is just like the first 15% of Fire and Blood, so there is a whole lot more to go after this. Anyways, I'm gonna use some charts and images in this video that I did not create. I'm not that talented, but I will try and give proper credit where it is due. Unfortunately, some of these images have been circulated online so much that it's just kind of impossible to find the original creators, but I will try my best. Now, before we can talk about the Targaryen kings, we need to talk about where they came from. So, the Targaryens were originally a minor house of dragon lords from old Valyria. Now, the Valyrian freehold was a great empire that dominated most of Essos for around 5,000 years. They were led by 40 houses of dragon lords, families who had the blood of the dragon in them, whatever that means. This gave them the ability to bond with and become dragon riders, and with these dragons, they dominated their empire. The Targaryens were originally a relatively minor of these dragon lord houses, but that would all come to a change very soon. In around the year 114 BC, that's how the timing for Game of Thrones works. BC means before Conquest, AC means after Conquest. In around the year 114 BC, Daenerys Targaryen, later known as Daenerys the Dreamer, had, well, a dream. And in that dream, she saw the destruction of Valyria, the great volcanoes that surrounded the region, the dragons, the entire empire going up in flames. Now, Targaryen dreams aren't like normal dreams. Some Targaryens are what are called dragon dreamers, meaning their dreams come true. And Daenerys was one of them. So she convinced her father, Aeron, to leave Valyria. So Aeron took his family and his 5 dragons and moved across the narrow sea all the way to Dragonstone, a small, tiny, barren rock just off the east coast of Westeros. 12 years later, Daenerys' dream came true. Valyria was destroyed in an event forever known as the Doom. Now, there on Dragonstone, the Targaryens lived for over a century. Now, a lot of this is pretty unimportant and kind of boring, so we're gonna skip over most of it. I'll just go through the names here. First, you had Aenar the Exile, then his son Daemon became the Lord of Dragonstone after that, and following him was his son Aegon. After Aegon, it went to his son Maegor, but after Maegor, it went to his brother Aerys. After Aerys, it went to his oldest son Alex, and then after Alex, it went to his brother Balon, and after Balon, it went to the third son, Daemon. Now, Daemon Targaryen had a son named Aerion. And this is really where our story begins. Around the year 30 BC, Aerion Targaryen had his first child, a daughter, whom he named Visenya. Then in 27, he had his first and only son, Aegon. And then a couple years later, he had another daughter named Rhaena. Aegon Targaryen was born in 27 BC and eventually became the Lord of Dragonstone. He was a great and fearsome warrior. He rode Balerion the Black Tread, the only surviving dragon from before the doom of Valyria, and he wielded the Valyrian steel sword Blackfire. Now, the Targaryens and the other lords of Valyria had a custom of marrying siblings to keep their line pure so the blood of the dragon would never make it to other houses. So Aegon married his older sister Visenya. Now, Visenya was a warrior, just like Aegon. She had been trained with the sword from a young age. She rode the dragon Vhagar, and she often fought on the front lines alongside Aegon. Visenya also wielded the Valyrian steel sword Dark Sister. Now, marrying his sister Visenya was Aegon's duty as heir, but something he did that wasn't a Targaryen custom was that he married his other sister, Rhaenys, as well. It said that he married Visenya out of duty and honor, and he married Rhaenys for his own desire. Now, Rhaenys was the complete opposite of Visenya. She wasn't a fighter. She loved arts and music and poetry, and most of all, she loved flying. She flew on her dragon Meraxes, and she took her everywhere, from all over Westeros, from north to south, all over Essos to east to west. It was her dream to one day sail west across the Sunset Sea to see what lands may lay beyond. Her dragon Meraxes was known to have golden eyes and silver scales. She was larger than Vhagar, but smaller than Balerion. Now, at this point in time, the 7 kingdoms of Westeros were all independent, ruled by their own individual kings, as they had been for millennia at this point. So before we continue, let's just go through all of these kingdoms and their rulers at this time. Now, the North was ruled by Torrhen Stark, the king in the North. The Westerlands, which were at that point called the Kingdom of the Rock, were ruled by Loren Lannister. The Reach, the Kingdom of the Reach, was ruled by Mern the Ninth Gardener. Dorne was ruled by Princess Maria Martell, an old woman nearly 80 years old. Argilac Durrandon the Arrogant was the ruler of the Stormlands. Ronald Arryn was the king of the Vale in the Mountains, though he was just a child, and his mother Shara was the regent. Now, perhaps the most feared of all of these kings was Harren Hor, the king of the Isles and the Rivers. An Ironborn, he ruled over the Riverlands and the Iron Islands with a tight fist, and he built the great castle Harrenhal, right at the northern point of the lake known as the God's Eye. Now, a lot of people think Aegon never visited Westeros before his conquest, but this is completely not true. There are verifiable reports that he and Visenya visited the city of Oldtown, the largest city in Westeros, long before the conquest, and there's even reports that he visited Lannisport, the second biggest city. Now, around 2 BC, Aegon received a request from Argilac Durrandon. He proposed that he would marry his daughter Argella to Aegon and give him the Riverlands in exchange for his help. But Aegon refused this offer. I mean, first, he already had 2 wives. Why would he want a third one? And besides, the Riverlands weren't Argilac's to give away. They were under the control of Harren. Aegon instead gave him a counteroffer. He wanted the Riverlands and Massey's Hook, the part of the Stormlands that would eventually become the Crownlands, and he demanded that Argilac Durandon's daughter marry his own bastard half-brother, Orys Baratheon. Argilac was infuriated by this offer. He refused to ever let his daughter marry a low-born bastard and completely refused Aegon's offer. Now, after this, Aegon summoned all of his advisors and all of his allies and soldiers to Dragonstone to come up with a plan. And there he sat. For 7 days, he deliberated. Aegon was never known to be a religious man, but it's said that the day before he finally made his decision, he spent the entire night in prayer. Once his decision was made, he sent ravens all across Westeros to every king and important lord in the realm bearing one message. From that day on, there would be but one king in Westeros, and that king would be Aegon. Everyone who bent the knee to him could keep their lands and powers and titles, and everyone who didn't would be destroyed. He then commissioned the Painted Table, a giant map of Westeros carved out of wood to help him plan his invasion. Now, the War of the Conquest has a lot of moving parts, so I'm going to try and explain it the best I can. Despite the fact that Aegon only had around 3,000 men, he had 3 dragons, so he decided the best course of action would be to split his troops and send them all in different directions. First, he sent Rhaenys along with Orys Baratheon, commanding a small number of troops towards Storm's End, where Argilac Durandon had been gathering his forces. The castle of Storm's End was nearly impenetrable, but Argilac Durandon wanted to fight, so on one rainy night, he walked out of his castle with his troops behind him, ready to make a last stand. Despite the fact that he greatly outnumbered the Targaryen host, they stood no chance against Rhaenys and Meraxes. It's said that Argilac Durandon was a fierce fighter and took down several men in single combat, despite his old age. Eventually, he ended up fighting Orys Baratheon one-on-one, and Orys was victorious, killing Argilac Durandon. Now, Argilac's daughter, Argella, actually managed to flee to the castle and tried to hold against the army for longer. But however, the defenders of the castle saw how it was going and they instead surrendered and delivered her to the enemy. Orys did, in fact, take Argella Durandon as his wife, and he would then become the Lord of Storm's End, becoming the first Baratheon Lord Paramount of the Stormlands. Aegon also sent Visenya, along with the Velaryon fleet, the largest fleet in all of Westeros, to the Vale. Now, they had an easy enough time conquering most of the land, but the Eyrie, the capital of the Vale, was completely impenetrable. It was built high atop a mountain, and no army could besiege it. Luckily for the Targaryens, though, Visenya had a dragon. She flew Vhagar high above the Eyrie and landed directly in its courtyard. It's said that when the regent, Shera, walked to the courtyard, she saw her son, Ronal Arryn, the king, sitting on Visenya's lap, asking if he could go on a ride on the dragon. Visenya obliged, and he and her rode around the Eyrie 3 times. It's said that Ronal Arryn took off a king and landed a lord. He kept his lands and titles, but he was forced to bend the knee to Aegon Targaryen. Aegon and his army personally went to Harrenhal, where Harren the Black stood strong in his gigantic castle. Along with Aegon was Edmund Tully, one of the first Westerosi lords to support Aegon. Harren refused to budge or surrender, saying that a dragon's fire couldn't burn stone. The problem was, it could burn anything else. So that night, Aegon rode high into the sky on Balarion and rained fire upon Harrenhal. Everything but the castle walls burned, including all the humans inside. It's said from some eyewitnesses that the stone towers themselves started to twist and crack and collapse from the heat of Balerion's fire. At this point, Aegon made Edmund Tully the Lord of the Riverlands and allowed the Iron Islands to choose their own ruler. They, of course, chose one of their own, an Ironborn named Vicon Greyjoy, the Lord Reaper of Pike, who then became the Lord Paramount of the Iron Islands. Meanwhile, Mern the Ninth, Gardener of the Reach, and Loren Lannister of the Rock were gathering together a huge army, said to be 55,000 strong, the largest army in the history of Westeros up until that point, and they began their march towards the God's Eye to meet Aegon in battle. South of the Blackwater, near where the King's Road would eventually run, the two armies met. The Targaryens were vastly outnumbered, but they had 3 dragons. The resulting battle became known as the Field of Fire, as the Westermen and Reachmen burned and were no match for the 3 dragons. Mern Gardner was killed and Loren Lannister was captured. Loren was allowed to retain his titles, and instead of being King of the Rock, he then became the Lord Paramount of the Westerlands. And with Mern Gardner dead, his whole family was wiped out, and their stewards, House Tyrell, were appointed as the Lord Paramounts of the Reach. At the same time, Torrhen Stark had gathered an army around Moat Cailin and was marching south. Eventually, he made it to the Trident, where he faced off against the army of Aegon Targaryen. It was thought that a huge battle would take place, and Torrhen's advisors all advised him to make a last stand. But surprisingly, Torrhen Stark crossed the Trident alone, where he bent the knee to Aegon Targaryen, declaring fealty to him. And thus, the king in the north became the Lord Paramount of the North, and Torrhen Stark would forever be remembered as the king who knelt. He may have lost his title, but he probably saved the lives of thousands of people. Queen Rhaenys was sent to Dorne to try and conquer it, but there she met Princess Maria Martell, the Old Toad as they called her. Maria said that the Dornish had no intention of fighting, but they also had no intention of submitting. And at that point, Rhaenys had no choice but to just leave. But she swore that she would one day return, and when she did, it would be with fire and blood. Then Aegon himself, along with his queens, went to Oldtown, where, in the Starry Sept, the holiest place in all of the Faith of the Seven, Aegon was crowned king by the High Septon. He was crowned king of the Andals, the Rhoynar, and the First Men, lord of the Seven Kingdoms, and protector of the realm. And this marks the beginning of the year 1 AC, or the end of Aegon's conquest. Though at this point, he only had 6 of the original 7 kingdoms, for Dorne had not yet submitted. But Aegon did rule 7 kingdoms because he'd split the kingdom of the Isles and the Rivers into 2, the Iron Islands and the Riverlands. Rhaenys made good on her promise to return to Dorne, and the First Dornish War lasted from 6 to 13 AC. It was bloody and brutal, but the Dornish never fought any open battles. As the dragons swooped in and destroyed their castles and cities, the Dornishmen simply abandoned them. They disappeared into the sands, hiding, allowing the Targaryens to do whatever they wished. Dorne was destroyed, but their armies and their people were intact. Just like the words of House Martell, Dorne remained unbowed, unbent, and unbroken. After the destruction of Dorne, Aegon declared victory and went back to King's Landing, but right as he did, the Dornish armies came back and retook all of the castles and cities that had been burnt down. During this war, many atrocities were committed on both sides. Orys Baratheon himself was captured and only later ransomed back after his right hand had been cut off. The Targaryens returned again and again, but to no success. Dorne was destroyed repeatedly, but was never conquered. Eventually, in the year 10 AC, the dragon Meraxes was hit in the eye by a scorpion bolt at Hellholt, and the dragon and her rider, Rhaenys, were both killed. Thus, the Dornish became dragon slayers, and Aegon was never able to capture Dorne. The war would continue for a few more years until Maria Martell herself died at a very old age in the year 13 AC, supposedly while having intimate relations with a stallion. Yeah, seriously, I mean, that's what it says in the book. Although this might just be a rumor her enemies came up with. The Dornish Wars would only continue for over a century, in fact, but not until the next generation. After Maria died, her son sent a letter to Aegon. No one knows what was on that letter, although there are many rumors. But for some reason, after reading it, Aegon agreed to declare peace with Dorne, and it remained unconquered for the rest of his reign. Some even say that the Dornish threatened to use the Faceless Men to assassinate Rhaenys' son Aenys, but no one's really sure. Aegon the Conqueror ruled for 24 more years, but never fought in a single other war. After the end of the Dornish Wars, his greatest focus was always on peace, keeping the king's peace. He traveled throughout the realm, holding court, being a wise and fair judge, even listening to the commoners. He said it was always best to stop a rebellion before it ever happened. He made sure to ingratiate himself with the local laws and to judge according to their customs. He consulted maesters and lords on all of these, and in fact, all of the 7 kingdoms and the rulers mostly kept their old titles and powers. The only difference now was that they all served one king, and that king kept the peace, forbidding any wars between the lords or the lords paramount. This was the first time in thousands of years that there was complete peace in all of Westeros. Though Aegon himself didn't officially declare the small council, he was the one who laid the groundwork for it. He would often listen to his counselors about every matter of ruling. He requested an archmaester from the Citadel to be a part of his council, thus becoming the first Grand Maester. Though Aegon himself was not religious, he consulted the High Septon on all religious matters and judgment so he could keep with Westerosi tradition. He's known to have called Orys Baratheon his strong right hand, and thus Orys became the first hand of the king. Though Orys himself actually resigned after the loss of his right hand, and then the position went to Edmund Tully, but it was eventually Ormond Strong who would remain the hand for most of Aegon's rule. The king made sure to always have a hand to help him rule. The city of King's Landing grew extremely quickly after the conquest, although Aegon himself preferred to live at Dragonstone like his ancestors. By the year 10 AC, King's Landing was one of the largest cities in the realm, and a decade later, it was larger than all except for Old Town and Lannisport. The 3 hills of the city were named after the 3 conquerors, Aegon's Hill being the biggest, followed by Visenya's Hill and Rhaenys' Hill. Speaking of the queens, they perhaps had more power than any other queens in the history of Westeros, except perhaps for Queen Alysanne. They both ruled alongside Aegon. Whenever Aegon wasn't at King's Landing, one of his queens was always with him and the other was sitting on the Iron Throne, ruling in his stead. Visenya, the warrior, was the one who established the King's Guard, saying the king should always be protected. In fact, she specifically requested for there to be 7 members of the King's Guard for the king of the 7 kingdoms. She chose from all types of people, bastards and lowborns to the sons of great lords. She chose based on loyalty, honor, and strength. And she chose correctly. All 7 of these Kingsguards would serve faithfully for the rest of their lives, and 2 of them would even give their lives defending Aegon. They were led by the first Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, Corlys Velaryon. These 7 men were so honorable that the term Kingsguard became synonymous with honor in future generations. Rhaenys, on the other hand, was very different. She loved the arts and music and poetry and patronized all of them while she was still alive. In fact, it's said that she even helped grow the Targaryen legend. Many great songs and poems praising the Targaryens were all commissioned by Rhaenys. She was loved by the commoners, and the entire realm mourned her eventual death. Aegon himself also began the construction of the Red Keep, a great castle in King's Landing that would eventually become the capital of the realm. All of this to say, Aegon truly was a great king and a great ruler, and he and his sisters would be forever considered one of the best rulers that Westeros ever had. Now, before we move on, we really need to talk about the Targaryen family tree. I'm just going to talk about the first few generations in this video, or at least however much that I need to talk about, because trust me, it gets a lot more complicated after this, so I'm going to try and keep it simple today. Aegon the Dragon had 2 sons, Aenys, born to Rhaenys in 7 AC, and Maegor, born to Visenya in 12 AC. Both of these children were a lot like their mothers. Aenys was born a sickly child, and he was shy and gentle. He would grow up to become a fine warrior, but not a spectacular one. Just like his mother, Aenys loved art and poetry, and Aegon himself always doted on him. As Rhaenys died when Aenys was still around 3 or 4 years old, Aegon was the one who raised him, and he had him by his side constantly. He might not have been a fighter, but Aegon was clearly training Aenys to be his successor. Now, Aenys loved astronomy, astrology, and poetry. He also loved music, and it's said that he had a sweet and beautiful singing voice. Now, Maegor was the exact opposite. It's said that he was twice the size of Aenys at birth, and from a young age, Visenya trained him to be a great warrior. By the time he was a teenager, he was one of the greatest fighters in the realm. He cared nothing about the arts, just battle and tourneys. Maegor was knighted by his father at the age of 16 with Blackfyre, becoming the youngest knight in the 7 Kingdoms at that time. Now, there are rumors out there that neither of these children were actually Aegon's. They say Aenys was actually the son of some artist or puppeteer that Rhaenys met along her travels, and they say Maegor was born of dark sorcery from Visenya, which she was known to practice. Now, there is some evidence to this. Aegon himself was quite old when he had his sons. Rhaenys was in her mid-30s when Aenys was born, and Visenya was over 40 when Maegor was born, which for that time period is incredibly old. Now, there is a certain irony in this. Aegon the Dragon, whose line would continue to rule Westeros for 300 years, never had any children, but I kind of disagree. Aenys, at least, I think for sure was Aegon's son. First of all, I don't think Rhaenys would do something like that. And besides, she was only in her mid-30s when Aenys was born, which is on the older side, but not out of the ordinary. Now, it's possible Visenya's son Maegor was born of dark sorcery, and this is why he never had any normal, healthy children in his life. But I also feel like they were each half of Aegon. Aenys had Aegon's sense of fairness and justice and kindness. He just didn't have his strength, physical or mental. Maegor, on the other hand, had the strength. He just didn't have anything else. Also, just to mention, when they were young, Aenys rode the dragon Quicksilver and Maegor had no dragon. Now, let's take a look at the family tree. Maegor never had any surviving children, so that's pretty simple. We can just forget about him on the family tree for a little while, despite the fact that he had a ton of wives. Aenys, on the other hand, married Alyssa Velaryon and had 7 children. The oldest was Rhaena, born in 23 AC, followed by Aegon, born in 26 AC, who was the heir apparent to Aenys, who himself was the heir of Aegon. Now, this younger Aegon would eventually come to be known as Aegon the Uncrowned. We will get to why in a little bit. Now, Aenys and Alyssa also had 3 younger kids. They had Viserys, born in 29, Okay, I wrote Jaehaerys in 36, but I think that's wrong. I think Jaehaerys was born in 34, and Alysanne, who was born in 36. Rhaena was shy and quiet, only having one childhood friend named Melanie Piper. Rhaena was a lot like her grandmother, the tragically killed Rhaenys, whom she was named after. Rhaena was shy and quiet and spent most of her time reading instead of socializing. She also rode the dragon Dreamfire, whom she named herself. She often acted like a mother to her much younger siblings, especially Jaehaerys and Alysanne. In fact, it was Rhaena that gave them each their dragon eggs, which would eventually hatch into Silverwing for Alysanne and the very famous Vermithor for Jaehaerys, whom you may have heard of. Vermithor would one day become the largest dragon in the entire world. Now, we will eventually come back to this, but Rhaena and Aegon would eventually get married and have 2 twin daughters, Rhaella and Arya. Remember Arya, but don't get too attached. Aegon had no dragon as a child, but he rode with his sister wife on Dreamfire, and he would eventually ride his father's dragon, Quicksilver. Okay, now that we're done with the whole family tree for this video, let's get on with the history. Aegon the Conqueror, in the year 37 AC, at the age of 64, died of a stroke. He was showing his grandsons Aegon and Viserys the painted table and telling them about his conquests when it all happened. Now, according to Targaryen custom, his body was burned, along with his Valyrian steel sword Blackfire, but no normal fire can damage Valyrian steel, so Blackfire emerged just fine, although it's said that after that, the color of the blade significantly darkened, and that Maegor himself was the one to retrieve the blade from the fire. Aegon's son Aenys was then crowned king and was cheered and beloved by the commoners. He soon went on tour across all of Westeros on horseback. Do you know how big Westeros is? That must have taken forever. But he was cheered all along the way, and he was just trying to be as friendly as possible. The sword Blackfire that Aenys inherited from his father, he in fact gave to his brother Maegor. Maegor already had a Valyrian steel sword, Dark Sister, which his mother had given him. But now Maegor had 2, although he preferred to wield Blackfire. Aenys wanted himself and Maegor to rule together. But at the start of his reign, chaos immediately broke out. You see, it had only been a generation or two since the unification of the 7 kingdoms, and there were some who still remembered back when they were free. Some lords just decided to rebel. Perhaps they wanted to regain that freedom. Some wanted to avenge their fathers and grandfathers who had been killed by the conqueror. But whatever the case, the entire realm erupted in rebellion early on in Aenys' rule. Many thought that Maegor would be a stronger and better king, and that Aenys himself admitted it by giving his brother Blackfire. Now, there are several things that happened in really quick succession here, so I'm going to go by it one by one. First of all, the new Lord of Harrenhal was killed, tortured to death by a man named Harren the Red, who claimed to be a descendant of Harren the Black, and Harren the Red styled himself the King of the Riverlands. He didn't declare himself the King of the Iron Islands, as he himself was not an Ironborn. A zealot Ironborn drowned god priest named Lodos the Twice Drowned rose up, declaring himself the independent ruler of the Iron Islands. Ronald Arryn, the kid who flew with Visenya on Vhagar as a child, was extremely loyal to Aegon and to Aenys, his successor, but he was usurped by his own brother Jonos, who had him thrown out the moon door to his death. And thus was the end of poor, loyal Ronald Arryn. Finally, the most dangerous of all of these threats was the man who called himself the Vulture King. He appeared out of nowhere and gathered a huge army of Dornishmen who ravaged the southern part of the Seven Kingdoms, apparently in revenge for what the Targaryens had done to Dorne. Now, the ruler of Dorne at this time, Princess Daria, denounced him and refused to support him. But there's a lot of rumors saying that she might have actually secretly been supporting him. Now, Aenys himself didn't want to fight. He actually wanted to talk to all of these rebels and negotiate, but they were having none of it. The rebels didn't want to talk. Aenys' advisors didn't want to talk. Aenys was also extremely indecisive, second-guessing every order he gave. He would give one order, then immediately countermand it and give the opposite order. He had no idea what he was doing, and he had no idea how to fix this problem. But luckily for him, it kind of all just fixed itself. The Greyjoys put down the rebellion in the Iron Islands and reaffirmed fealty to the Targaryens. Yet the Greyjoys were the loyal ones this time. A lord named Allard Royce from the Vale led a resistance against Jonos Arryn, and in fact managed to kick him and his supporters out of most of the Vale, and even managed to besiege the Eyrie. Now, the Eyrie itself was pretty much impregnable, but there was one thing they weren't accounting for: dragons. This time, it was Maegor, riding none other than his father's Balerion the Black Dread, whom he had claimed after his father's death. Seeing this, the defenders of the Eyrie panicked, and then they threw Jonos Arryn out the moon door. But Maegor wouldn't take surrender for an answer. He took the surrendering defenders and had them hanged naked from the walls of the Eyrie with loose nooses so that they would all slowly suffocate to death. Really showing a bit of his personality here for the first time, Maegor. Now, the biggest and greatest threat was the Vulture King, who had a ton of supporters and a massive army. Luckily, several armies came to fight him, including ones led by, a lady Ellen Karen of Nightsong, Lord Harmon Dondarrion, Samwell Tarly, who was known as Savage Sam Tarly, incredible name, and old man Orys Baratheon, who is still around and kicking. Orys wanted revenge for losing his hands at the hand of a Dornishman so long ago that he took the commanders of the Vulture King's army and hacked off all of their limbs, hanging them in his tent. Orys died on the way back home, but his son Davos said that Orys died peacefully and happily, being satisfied with the revenge he had gotten. Apparently, just hacking off the limbs of a bunch of Dornishmen 20 years later makes up for the fact that he lost his right hand, apparently. Also, the Vulture King himself was captured, and Savage Sam Tarly tied him between two posts and just left him out in the elements. Later accounts say this was to let the vultures themselves picket him to death, but it's most likely he died of thirst or starvation or exposure. Now, because they had done all of this for him, Aenys was pretty much required to give all of these people more titles and lands and rewards, and it just made him seem all the more weak. He even made Maegor his hand, and for 2 years there was relative peace. Until eventually Maegor got another idea. Now, Maegor was already married to Cerise Hightower, but she was significantly older than him, and they had not had any children yet. So, Maegor declared her barren and decided to take another wife, Alice Haraway, the daughter of the new Lord of Harrenhal. Now, the High Septon, who is never given a name, by the way, but he is the same High Septon that I will be talking about throughout the rest of this video. The High Septon calls this an abomination. He calls Maegor an abomination, and he completely forbids this marriage. Cerise Hightower, as well, is not happy, and she declares herself Maegor's one and only true wife, and that he returned to her immediately. Having no other choice, Aenys gave his brother Maegor the option of either being exiled from the realm or going back to his first wife. Maegor chose exile. Now, this is around the exact same time where Aenys announced that his son Aegon would marry his daughter Rhaena. Apparently, they were always close as children, gross, and they had always expected this to happen, and neither of them objected to this marriage, so they seemed to be into it. But the High Septon was having absolutely none of it. He called Aenys an abomination. He called Rhaena an abomination. He called Aegon an abomination. Everyone was just an abomination to him. Now, this was apparently because Aegon was getting a little too popular with the young ladies of the realm, and Rhaena was spending a little too much time with a girl named Elaine Royce, who she apparently even took dragon riding on Dreamfire, something she only ever did with Aegon himself. But the High Septon and the Faithful were already incredibly upset at the Targaryens, so this was just terrible timing, and a serious religious uprising began brewing. Visenya herself, who, yeah, is still around, by the way, gave Aenys two options. Either cancel the marriage, or she would go to Old Town, burn down the Starry Sept, the holiest place of the faith, and kill the High Septon. In response to this, Aenys, as usual, did nothing. It seemed that Aenys was just shocked that the people didn't love him anymore, and he had no idea why. He went ahead with the marriage and sent Rhaena and Aegon on a tour across the Seven Kingdoms. On horseback. He didn't even let them bring Dreamfire with them. Apparently, he thought that Rhaena being on a dragon and Aegon on horseback would make him look weak, but this went exactly as suspected, and eventually, once they made it to Crackhall Castle, they were besieged by a giant mob of angry peasants of the faithful, and were essentially trapped inside the castle. Militant Faith of the Seven groups called the Poor Fellows and the Warrior Sons began another uprising, and they even captured parts of King's Landing itself. The entire realm was in full-scale rebellion, and one Bravosi emissary even remarked that it seemed like the High Septon was the true king of Westeros, for he was the one who held all the power. And then Aenys himself, in 42 AC, at the age of 35, suddenly and very anticlimactically died. Now, a lot of people say Visenya poisoned him so her son Maegor could take the throne, but it seems more likely that Aenys just died of severe stress. The poor guy was just not cut out to be king. Aenys' body was burned by Dragonfire on Dragonstone, where his remains were interred besides those of his parents. The funeral was attended by his wife, Alyssa Velaryon, as well as their youngest children, Viserys, Jaehaerys, and Alysanne. Visenya, who was in her 70s at this point, flew to Pentos, brought back Maegor, and had him crowned king instead of Aegon, who was still trapped at Crackhall Castle, though he was the true heir. This is why Aegon began to be known as Aegon the Uncrowned, and his mother and siblings all flew to Driftmark, where they would seek refuge with the Velaryons. Maegor was still challenged by the warrior sons who had complete control of the Hill of Rhaenys in King's Landing. The leader of the warrior sons, known as Daemon the Devout, challenged Maegor to a trial of 7. Now, if you haven't read or seen A Night of the Seven Kingdoms, this is basically how a trial of 7 works. It's essentially a trial by combat, but instead of being a 1v1, it's a 7v7. Each of the combatants has to find 6 knights, they have to be knights, to fight for them. And at the end, the last one standing wins, unless, of course, one of the combatants withdraws their accusation or yields, at which point the trial ends. If Maegor won, the warrior sons would accept him as the king. Now, Maegor initially had a lot of trouble finding knights who would join him until some random guy called Dick Bean stepped up. He wasn't even a knight, he was just some guy. And I guess embarrassed, some other knights stepped forward, and eventually Daemon had a full crew of 7. Also, one of these 5 knights who joined Maegor was known as Sir Lucifer Massey. I just had to mention that. His name is literally Lucifer. Now, we don't have too much information on the trial itself, and sources differ, but this is what we know for sure. Dick Bean himself was killed almost immediately, obviously. In the end, it was Maegor himself versus Daemon the Devout and one other man who were left standing. Now, the other 2 were both already heavily injured, but in the end, Maegor was victorious, although he suffered a severe blow to the head, rendering him unconscious. Many even thought the king himself had died, until Visenya rushed to his side, removed his helmet, and announced that he was still breathing. Maegor would remain in a coma for the next 27 days. It was only on the 28th day that Alice Haraway, Maegor's second wife, arrived from Pentos with a woman named Tiana of the Tower, who would soon be Maegor's third wife, a supposed witch and courtesan from Pentos. At this point, she immediately took full custody of Maegor's care, and he was conscious and up again on that exact same day. Then Maegor went and burnt down the sept at the top of the Hill of Rhaenys, killing all those inside, including most of whom who had decided to support him as king. It was at this point that Rhaena and Aegon finally managed to escape Crackhall Castle, as the soldiers besieging them decided to go join the larger faith militant uprising, and the 2 went to Casterly Rock, where they sought refuge with Lord Lyman Lannister. Also, the High Septon continued to call them abominations as well, and then when Maegor married his third wife, he called her an abomination too. He was getting really power hungry, this High Septon. King Aenys' wife, Alyssa, as well as her children, Viserys, Jaehaerys, and Alysanne, were also present at this wedding, causing many to believe that Aegon's own family had abandoned him in favor of Maegor. This is when Aegon started to be called the Uncrowned. This is also when Rhaena gave birth to their children, twins, Rhaella and Arya. Many people at this time said Maegor's wives and mother were actually the ones ruling the realm. And yeah, Visenya, who was extremely old at this point, had a lot of the power. Maegor himself was fully engrossed with the construction of the Red Keep. He changed, destroyed, or completely added new things that his predecessors hadn't, and he was the one who eventually finished building the Great Castle. He had secret tunnels and passages built all throughout the castle in case he ever needed to make a quick escape. And after it was completed, he had a great feast for all the builders, after which they were all put to the sword. This all occurred in the year 45 AC, which is when he officially began construction of the Dragon Pit at the top of Rhaenys' Hill. Eventually, he and his mother went to Old Town with their dragons to try and put down the Faith militant uprising, But it turns out they didn't have to do too much. The High Septon, who had been calling everyone abominations for years at this point, who was only 53 and in good health, suddenly just died. It's not really known why. It might have been assassination, or he might have just ended his own life knowing who was coming for him. We just don't really know. Although at this point, Maegor did reconcile with Cerise Hightower, who had gone back to Old Town at this point, and brought her back as his wife. So now he had 3 wives. Now, while Visenya and Maegor were away at Old Town, Aegon and Rhaena used this chance to sneak back into King's Landing, but they weren't here to take the throne. They wanted dragons. Rhaena rode back on Dreamfire, and Aegon claimed his father's dragon, Quicksilver. It's said that they rode into the city on mules and flew away on dragons. The lords of the West, including the Lannisters, began to raise an army in support of Aegon. Even Rhaena's childhood friend Melanie Piper donned armor and joined the front line as a fighter. They soon marched out from Casterly Rock, although without Rhaena or Dreamfire for some reason, although this likely wouldn't have mattered as neither of them were fighters and Dreamfire was quite young and small anyway. Maegor himself faced the host in battle, and for the first time since the fall of Valyria, dragon fought dragon. Although it wasn't exactly a fair fight, as Balerion was like 4 times the size of Quicksilver and easily killed him, leading to the death of both the dragon and Aegon himself. It's said that the Vale in the north were planning to support Aegon if he looked like he had any chance of winning, but that didn't end up happening and they all submitted to Maegor once again. But with that, there was essentially no more rebellions against Maegor. His rule was completely free from resistance. It was at this point that people began to call him the Kinslayer and Maegor the Cruel, although never directly to his face, as that would mean certain death. But despite all his victories, Maegor was never able to secure an heir. First, it was Alice Haraway, who gave birth to a stillborn, deformed, almost dragon-like baby, but Maegor refused to believe it was his, and Alice, panicking, decided she needed to get pregnant in any way possible, and that's what she tried. She attempted to get pregnant through any man she possibly could. Tiana found out about this and told Maegor, who found all of these men, tortured them until they all confessed, and had them killed. And Alice Haraway, he gave to Tiana herself, who slowly tortured her to death over the course of a week. And Maegor himself was there to watch all of it. It was at this moment that Visenya the Conqueror died. And in this confusion, Alyssa Velaryon, King Aenys' wife, as well as her children Jaehaerys and Alysanne, escaped King's Landing, and they even managed to steal the sword Dark Sister and take it with them. Alyssa's older child, Viserys, had actually been Maegor's squire at this point, and Maegor tortured him to try and find out the whereabouts of his family. Viserys most likely never knew, but Maegor had him tortured and executed anyway. And then, right around this time, Cerise Hightower died of an illness, and Maegor decided that he needed even more wives. 3 more wives, specifically. Shayn Westerling, Eleanor Costaigne, and Rhaena Targaryen. He thought marrying Rhaena would unite all of the branches of the family, and if she had a son, he could be the heir. Rhaena came willingly but reluctantly, and the 3 were married to Maegor all at once, and became known as the Black Brides, since all 3 of them were widows. Jane and Eleanor became pregnant, but both of the children ended up stillborn. Jane's child supposedly ended up deformed, having both male and female parts, And Eleanor's child was supposedly eyeless and had the wings of a dragon. Many people said Maegor was cursed, he was born of dark magic, that's why he couldn't have kids. But Maegor instead blamed his other wife, Tiana, and had her imprisoned and tortured until she confessed to sabotaging the other pregnancies, at which point he had her executed. Then came another rebellion, a serious one this time. The Tullys, the Baratheons, the Velaryons, and the new High Septons all united under Jaehaerys Targaryen, the son of King Aenys, as their new king. They gathered an army at Storm's End, and they had two dragons, Vermithor, written by Jaehaerys, and Silverwing, written by his sister Alysanne. Two eventually turned to three, as Rhaena on Dreamfire escaped King's Landing and went to support her brother's claim to the throne. And she even managed to steal Blackfire straight from its scabbard, right from underneath Maegor's view. This host kept gaining more and more supporters, and Maegor just kept losing them. It looked like a great battle was brewing, but it did not come to that. Soon afterwards, in the year 48 AC, at the age of 36, Maegor Targaryen the Cruel was found dead, impaled upon the Iron Throne itself, only found in the morning by his wife, Queen Eleanor. It's unknown how this happened. He might have done it himself, seeing how the situation was going, or it might have been one of the Kingsguard, or it might have been someone else. We really have no clue. But thus ended the reign of King Maegor the Cruel, the third Targaryen king of Westeros. His reign lasted exactly 6 years and 66 days. Well, that will just about do it for this video, guys. This took forever to write and make, but if you made it all the way, please do like the video and subscribe. It would really help a lot. If there was any other interesting lore in this time period that I missed, please do mention it in the comments. And if I might have gotten anything wrong, please mention that as well. And tell me, do you want to see this story continue? Because I do want to keep going with this series. Anyway, that's all for now. I promise I will make more videos soon. Thanks for watching. Bye!